The warm hum of the ship's engines reverberated beneath the feet of the crew, a constant reminder that they were on a long journey through the depths of space. The endless black expanse outside the observation windows was both comforting and unnerving. Commander Jace Harlan stood at the helm of the Phoenix, his fingers lightly tapping the console as he glanced at the stars flickering by. It was just another routine mission, until it wasn't. "Commander, we've received an unusual transmission," Lieutenant Ava Matthews's voice crackled over the intercom, pulling Jace from his thoughts. He turned toward the communications station, where Matthews sat, looking puzzled and a little perturbed. "Unusual how?" Jace asked, raising an eyebrow. The crew of the Phoenix had dealt with strange signals before: miscommunication from distant planets, malfunctioning equipment, random space anomalies, but nothing that ever had them second-guessing their next move. "It's not exactly in any known language," Matthews replied, her eyes glued to the readout on her screen. She swiveled in her chair, staring up at Jace with wide eyes. "And it's not from anywhere we've charted. It's coming from deep within the uncharted sector, the Draken Rift." Jace felt a small flicker of unease in his stomach. The Draken Rift was an area of space known for its mysterious properties: distorted gravity wells, strange electromagnetic pulses, and warped time cycles. It was a place that even the most seasoned explorers avoided unless absolutely necessary. And the fact that someone, or something, was transmitting from it, well, that was the kind of thing you didn't ignore. "Put it through," he said, his voice firm, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. Could it be a distress call? A hidden message from an ancient civilization? Or perhaps something more dangerous? Ava hesitated for a moment, then pressed a few buttons on her console. The screen in front of her flickered, and the transmission played out, a series of broken, distorted sounds, like the whispering of voices half-heard in a thunderstorm. Then, as if the universe itself had decided to clarify, a voice came through clearly. It was human. "Help, please. We need assistance." The voice was weak, strained, as though whoever had spoken had not used their vocal cords in far too long. "We are stranded in the rift. The gate is closed. Please, help." Jace's heart skipped a beat. He exchanged a glance with his second-in-command, Captain Alara Tress, who had come up behind him silently. Her face mirrored his concern. If this was a legitimate distress signal, they were the closest ship capable of offering assistance. But the Draken Rift wasn't the kind of place you just went into unprepared. "Is there a source location on this?" Jace asked, his mind already calculating the risks. "Can we pinpoint where this is coming from?" "It's moving," Matthews replied, her voice betraying the confusion she felt. "It doesn't seem to be coming from any one place, but, rather, well, it's hard to explain." "Sounds like we have a ghost on our hands," Captain Tress muttered, rubbing her temples. "Just like the old legends." Jace didn't want to entertain the idea of ghosts, but he couldn't dismiss the strange signal. The rift was known for playing tricks on sensors, but it shouldn't be this erratic. There had to be something more to it. "We need to go to the rift," Jace said, his tone resolute. "If someone's out there, we can't just leave them stranded. Prepare the crew for a potential rescue mission. I'll need everyone on high alert." As he gave the orders, a few murmurs broke out amongst the crew, whispers of uncertainty, but no one voiced their concerns outright. They were all seasoned enough to know the dangers of the unknown. But this was their job, this was why they were here, to explore, to discover, to go where no one else would. They couldn't afford to back down now. The ship changed course, the engines shifting as they set their sights on the rift. The atmosphere on board grew tense. The crew kept busy with their tasks, but the unease was palpable. Every now and then, Jace would catch a glance or a whisper exchanged between officers, and he couldn't blame them. Everyone knew the stories, everyone had heard the rumors about the rift, about the ships that had entered and never returned, about the strange phenomena that defied all scientific understanding. Jace's mind wandered back to the voice they had heard. Who was it? What did they mean by "the gate is closed"? The rift was full of strange, almost mythical structures, gates, portals, objects that no one fully understood. Perhaps it was one of these things the voice referred to. Maybe it was something older, something far more dangerous. "Commander," Tress spoke again, breaking his thoughts. "I think you should know that some of the senior crew members have expressed concerns about going into the rift." Jace raised an eyebrow. "And?" "They're scared," she said bluntly. "You heard the same transmission we did. No one's ever gone in there and come back unscathed. You'll have to make a decision soon, one way or another." Jace's lips thinned. He was the commander, and it was his responsibility to make the call. But he couldn't deny that a part of him, the part that knew the risks, the part that had seen so many ships return to port empty, their crews never found, felt a chill run down his spine. "I'll make it clear to them. We're not turning back," Jace said. He had to say it with conviction, even if doubts gnawed at the edges of his resolve. "We've come too far to turn away now. This is what we're here for." Tress nodded slowly, though there was still a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Understood, sir. I'll get the team ready." As she left, Jace stared out at the blackness of space, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in his gut. The stars seemed to blink a little less brightly now, the void stretching out before him like a dark maw, waiting to swallow them whole. They were getting closer to the rift. The tension was palpable by the time the Phoenix reached the edge of the Draken Rift. The outer boundary of the rift was marked by a haze of swirling gas, nebulous clouds shifting with strange patterns. It wasn't just a visual phenomenon, it had a certain pull to it. As the ship approached, the instruments began to glitch, and the usual hum of the engines faltered, throwing the crew into a tense silence. "Steady," Jace murmured, his eyes glued to the controls. He wasn't just the commander here, he was also the first to feel the hair on the back of his neck rise in response to the unknown. "Stay calm." The stars around them seemed to warp and twist, giving the sensation that the ship was not only moving through space but being bent and compressed by an unseen force. There was an oppressive weight to the air, as though the very fabric of reality itself was being stretched. "Can you get a lock on that signal?" Jace asked Matthews. She was working furiously at her console, her fingers flying over the keys, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm not sure," Matthews said, her voice a mix of frustration and confusion. "The signal is fluctuating. It's almost like it's moving with us." Jace's grip tightened on the edge of the console. "We're being drawn in." The ship lurched suddenly, the sound of strained metal echoing through the halls. The crew staggered, and the lights flickered ominously. "Brace yourselves," Jace shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The Phoenix lurched again, a violent shake that sent crew members stumbling across the bridge. Jace grabbed hold of the console to steady himself, his knuckles turning white as the ship groaned under the pressure of the gravitational anomalies pulling at it from every direction. The entire crew was on edge, each person doing their best to maintain control as the unknown force intensified. "Status report." Jace barked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Matthews quickly regained her balance and turned to face him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The rift's gravity is messing with our systems. It's like nothing I've seen before. Our sensors are getting scrambled, and I can barely get a reading on anything outside of the ship." "How close are we to the signal source?" Jace asked, still keeping his voice controlled, though his thoughts were racing. Whatever was happening, they had to push forward. There were people, alive, out there, and if there was any chance of saving them, they had to get to them now. "Hard to tell," Matthews admitted, her fingers tapping furiously at the console. "The signal's bouncing all over the place, like it's coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It's almost as if it's following us." Jace's gaze snapped to the readouts in front of him. The ship's trajectory was being warped, her course constantly shifting as though they were caught in a space-time whirlpool, tugged in a dozen directions by unseen forces. "Shut down the autopilot," Jace ordered. "Manually adjust course." "I'm trying." Matthew shot back, her hands flying over the control panel. It's like the ship itself doesn't want to listen. Jace's mind raced. The crew was trained for this, trained for the unexpected. But this wasn't something anyone had ever prepared for. If the rift was affecting their ship's systems, then they had no way of knowing how far the damage had spread. They could be lost in this void forever. "Any sign of the gate?" Jace asked, his voice quieter now. The cryptic message from the transmission was still rattling in his mind. If the gate truly existed, it was the key to everything. But if it was locked, what did that mean for them? "It's still too unstable to get a solid reading," Matthews replied, her tone taut with frustration. "But I'm detecting some sort of energy spike, almost like a pulse." "It's not natural, Commander. It's like something is alive in there." Jace clenched his jaw. Whatever was in the rift was no ordinary phenomenon. This was something sentient, something that could manipulate space itself. They had to keep moving. They had no choice. "Captain," Jace turned to Tress, who had been watching the unfolding events with a calm yet knowing expression. "What's your read on the crew?" Tress had always been good at understanding the pulse of their team. As the captain, she was the one who would know if morale was starting to crack under pressure. "They're nervous," she said, her voice even. "But they'll follow you. They trust you." Jace nodded, though the weight of responsibility was heavy on his shoulders. Every decision now mattered. Every second was a gamble. The crew was on the edge, and it wouldn't take much for things to spiral out of control. "Get to the engineering bay," he said, his gaze hardening. "I want full diagnostics on every system we have. See if we can find a way to cut through whatever's scrambling our controls. We need to get ahead of this before we lose all control." Tress gave a sharp nod, but before she could move, the ship trembled again, this time more violently than before. It was a deep, gut-churning shake that rattled everything in sight. The lights flickered out completely for a moment, and when they returned, they were dim and uncertain. "What the hell was that?" Lieutenant Daniels called out from his station in the corner, his voice edged with fear. "We're being pulled into something," Matthew shouted, her hands shaking as she struggled to maintain control of the ship. "I can't stop it." Jace's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that would break their descent. The energy readings were spiking. They were in freefall now, at the mercy of the rift's strange physics. "Everyone brace for impact," he yelled. The ship was being swallowed whole by the rift. Moments later, the Phoenix's systems sputtered as the force of the anomaly battered against its hull. Jace could hear the creaks and groans of the ship as it fought against the gravitational warping. The interior lights dimmed again, then brightened, flickering in and out as though struggling to hold on to some semblance of normality. "We're losing altitude," Matthews shouted. "We're falling directly into it. Get us out of here." Jace barked, though he knew the words were almost futile. The rift had them in its grasp, and he had no idea how to escape it. "We're too deep in now," Matthews murmured, her fingers moving frantically. "We're past the point of no return. The rift is collapsing in on itself, and it's dragging us in with it." Jace's heart pounded in his chest. The rift wasn't just an obstacle. It was a force of nature, an unstoppable entity, and they had no defense against it. The only thing they could do was move forward, deeper into its clutches. "Get me a visual on that energy pulse," Jace commanded, though his voice wavered with the crushing pressure of the situation. "We're not turning back." Matthews hesitated but complied, pulling up a blurry, fragmented image on the screen. The pulses were getting stronger, more frequent, like the beating heart of the rift itself. They were so close now that the signal was almost deafening, pounding through the ship's systems with a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the ship lurched again, this time harder than before. The crew was thrown violently against their restraints, and Jace gritted his teeth, struggling to maintain his composure. The hum of the engines dropped to a low, guttural growl, as if the Phoenix was protesting its impending fate. "Damage report," Jace demanded, his voice rising over the chaos. "Hull integrity, compromised," Lieutenant Daniels shouted back. "We're taking on external damage from the gravitational fluctuations. Shields are weakening. We need to get control of the ship, now, Jace muttered, his mind working furiously. They couldn't afford to lose the ship, not now. They were too deep into the rift, and there was no telling what dangers lay ahead. Commander! Matthews shouted again, panic rising in her voice. There's a station, a structure, it's ahead of us, and it's huge. The energy readings are off the charts, this has to be the source of the signal. Jace's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the chaotic readings on the screen. Set a course for it, he said, his voice unwavering despite the uncertainty. This is it. We're going in. The Phoenix's descent was relentless. The rift was closing in, swallowing them whole, but the structure Matthews had identified loomed ahead, an unnatural sprawl of metal and technology. For a moment, Jace could only stare at the impossibility of it. The station was colossal, too massive to be built by any known species. It was ancient, but alive. Its surfaces glowed with strange symbols, like something out of a forgotten myth. As they drew closer, Jace couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. They had arrived. But the real question was, what waited for them inside? The Phoenix shuddered once more as it drew closer to the enormous structure that seemed to stretch out endlessly before them. The station, a vast, angular construction that was both eerily organic and unnervingly mechanical, loomed in the distance, pulsing with an unnatural energy. It was almost as if the station itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with the rift that surrounded it. As the ship's systems flickered in and out of control, Jace's heart raced. The crew was quiet, each member of the Phoenix clinging to the fragile hope that they had made the right decision by coming here. Commander, Matthews's voice broke the silence, shaky but determined. We're getting pulled in faster than we anticipated. I'm losing control. The gravitational field is. Cut the engines, Jace snapped, his eyes scanning the ship's diagnostics. We need to slow our descent. Matthews's hands were a blur as she frantically tried to reroute power, but the force of the rift's pull made even basic control a challenge. I'm trying, but, her voice faltered. We're being sucked in like a vacuum. Elara Tress, who had been standing behind Jace, watching the chaos unfold with quiet focus, stepped forward. The rift isn't just pulling us in. It's guiding us. It's deliberate. Guiding us where? Jace asked, turning to face her. There was a note of urgency in his voice now, an undercurrent of fear that even he couldn't mask. Where are we going? I think, we're being led straight to that structure, Tress said, her voice soft but filled with something else, resignation? A sense of inevitability? It's like it's waiting for us. Jace's pulse quickened. The structure they were heading toward, this impossible, ancient station, wasn't just some random relic in the rift. It was as though it had been designed for them to find it. The thought made his skin prickle. The signal had been a call, but who, or what, had been calling? And why? We need to make a decision, Commander, Matthews said. Her voice was tight, fear creeping through the cracks of her normally calm demeanor. We're close enough now that we can try to slow down or we can go all the way in. If we don't do something soon, we'll crash into it. Jace swallowed hard, his mind racing. They were no longer in control of their own fate. Every sensor, every readout, screamed that the rift was alive, that it was manipulating them, controlling their every move. But there was one undeniable fact, there was something important here. Something that had been waiting, hidden in the rift for who knew how long. We're going in, he said decisively. He knew the danger, but he also knew that turning back now would mean risking the lives of everyone on board. If they didn't understand the source of the signal, the rift might consume them all without mercy. The Phoenix hurtled toward the structure, her systems barely holding on. Outside the observation windows, the station loomed larger and larger, its shadow swallowing the stars around it, blotting out everything else. Its surface was a chaotic blend of geometric shapes, curved lines, and sharp edges that seemed to defy all logic, all laws of physics. It was massive, larger than any ship Jace had ever seen, a sprawling labyrinth of alien architecture. Brace for impact. Jace shouted, as the ship was pulled into the station's gravitational field. He watched the crew scramble, securing themselves to their stations, but there was no escaping the inevitable. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything seemed to stop. The ship was suspended in midair, caught in the thrumming pulse of the rift's power. The creaking of the Phoenix's hull echoed in the tense silence, the ship unable to move forward or back. Then, with a suddenness that made Jace's heart jump into his throat, the ship lurched violently forward. The station seemed to open in front of them, like a mouth, or a gate, and they were sucked inside. The Phoenix shuddered as it passed through a massive, gaping archway, her hull scraping against some unseen force, but they were no longer free-falling. The ship had been gently caught by an unseen hand, guided safely into the interior of the structure. "Stabilizing," Matthews said, her voice shaky but relieved. "We've made it inside. The external damage is minimal." Jace exhaled slowly, his breath catching in his chest. They were inside, safe, for now. But his mind was racing. What had just happened? What were they looking at? The interior of the structure was unlike anything Jace had ever seen. It was vast, far more immense than the exterior had led him to believe. A cavernous space, filled with towering walls of jagged stone, dark and smooth, slick as though they had been sculpted by an otherworldly hand. Strange symbols glowed faintly along the surfaces, lines of unknown origin etched into the material, pulsing in time with the energy that hummed throughout the station. The air was thick, heavy with something Jace couldn't quite place, something ancient, and old, and full of power. "Is it just me, or does this place feel alive?" Lieutenant Daniels muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He stood at the observation window, staring out at the strange terrain that stretched out before them. Jace felt it too. The station pulsed like a heart, alive with an intelligence that hummed beneath its surface. There was something deeply unsettling about it, and yet, it was almost inviting. "What is this place?" Matthews asked, as she stepped forward from her station, her voice filled with awe. "I don't know," Jace answered, his eyes narrowing. "But I'm going to find out." Tress stepped up beside him. "The rift led us here, Jace. You don't think it's just coincidence, do you?" He turned to her, his expression serious. "No. I don't think anything about this is a coincidence." He paused, then added, "But we have no choice but to move forward. There's a reason we're here. We just have to figure out what it is." The doors to the ship's hangar bay opened with a hiss, revealing an eerie stillness on the other side. The crew members, now outfitted in their tactical suits, moved cautiously, weapons drawn, ready for anything. As they stepped out onto the strange metallic surface, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step echoed in the vast silence, and the air itself seemed to shift, as if reacting to their presence. He motioned for the team to spread out, keeping their formations tight. The station was huge, the walls seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into shadowy corridors and towering spires that loomed overhead. The floor was slick and uneven, but it pulsed with an underlying energy that seemed to hum with each footstep. At the far end of the hangar, a set of enormous doors stood open, beckoning them forward. Jace looked back at the crew. "Stick together," he ordered. "We don't know what's waiting for us in there." With a deep breath, Jace led the way through the open doors. As they stepped through the threshold, they were greeted by an unexpected sight, a long, winding hallway that seemed to stretch on for miles. The walls glowed faintly, shifting between hues of blue and purple, and the symbols etched into the stone-like surface seemed to move, as though reacting to the crew's presence. "This is unlike anything we've ever seen," Tress murmured, her voice filled with both awe and caution. "It's alive." "I know," Jace replied. "We have to be careful. Whatever this place is, it doesn't want us here." "Not yet." They walked deeper into the station, each step taking them further into the unknown. And with every step, the pulse of the rift grew stronger, as if the heart of the station itself was calling to them. The deeper they went, the more alien the station became. Strange chambers, labyrinthine hallways, and empty rooms filled with odd, unidentifiable technology appeared and disappeared like fleeting shadows. But what made Jace's skin crawl more than anything was the sense that they were not alone. It wasn't a feeling of being watched, it was as if the entire station had become aware of their presence, and it was waiting for something. Finally, they reached a vast central chamber, an open space that seemed to stretch out forever. The walls were covered in ancient symbols, glowing faintly in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. In the center of the room, there was an enormous, pulsating orb, suspended in midair by invisible forces. The orb was surrounded by what looked like a series of control panels, the surfaces covered in intricate designs that seemed to shift when Jace looked away. The pulse of the rift intensified as they approached the orb. It was like the heartbeat of the station itself, calling out to them. "We're close," Jace whispered. "I can feel it." But what would they find here? The hum of the pulsating orb grew louder as Jace and the crew gathered around the central chamber, drawn by an invisible force. The air seemed thicker now, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of Jace's neck stand up. The pulse reverberated through the walls, through the very floor beneath them, almost as if the station itself was alive, resonating with their presence. Jace stepped closer to the orb, his eyes narrowing as the symbols etched into the walls seemed to flicker in response. They weren't random markings. No, these were purposeful, deliberate, and they seemed to be pointing toward the orb at the center of the room. He could feel the weight of the crew behind him, but this time, there was no tension in their movements, only the sense of anticipation, of something momentous about to unfold. "Commander," Matthews said quietly from behind him, her voice tinged with awe. "What is it? What is this place?" Jace didn't have an answer. He had theories, but they felt insignificant in the face of what lay before them. The orb itself seemed to pulse with life, as if it held the knowledge of the universe within its depths, knowledge that could change everything. The rift had brought them here, but why? What was this structure waiting to reveal to them? "It's a gateway," Tress said softly, almost to herself. "A threshold." "Threshold to what?" Jace asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Tress paused, her eyes flicking to the symbols around them, then back to the orb. "To something beyond what we know. A point of transition. Maybe it's what the rift is, a boundary, a doorway. And this station is, its keeper." Jace nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing, though hearing it out loud somehow made the thought more real. This wasn't just a place of unknown origin, it was something designed to bridge gaps. Gaps between dimensions, between realities. Maybe even between different species. He reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against the surface of the orb. For a moment, nothing happened, and Jace almost thought he had been wrong, until the pulse suddenly escalated. The orb flared with a brilliant light, blinding them all for a split second. Then, just as quickly, it dimmed, leaving behind a steady hum that vibrated through the very air around them. "Jace!" Matthews shouted, her voice strained with fear. "Look out!" The ground beneath their feet rumbled, and with a violent shockwave, the walls of the chamber began to shift, the stone-like surfaces sliding open, revealing hidden corridors and pathways. But the real danger was closer. The walls seemed to be closing in on them, and the air had turned thick and oppressive. The pulse of the orb was no longer a comforting hum, it had become erratic, chaotic, a warning that they had overstayed their welcome. "We need to get out of here," Jace yelled, his heart racing. "Move! Now!" The crew scrambled to retreat, but the shifting walls had trapped them. The once open chamber was now closing off, the corridors locking into place, as if the station itself was sealing them in. Panic started to rise in the crew, their faces filled with fear as the space around them grew smaller by the second. "Stay calm," Jace commanded, though his own pulse was quickening. "Stay together. There has to be a way out." Matthews was already at one of the walls, trying to pry open a panel to reveal a possible exit. "I can't get it to open," she shouted, her voice cracking with frustration. "Try the orb," Jace called, his mind working quickly. The orb was the focal point. It had triggered the change in the environment, so maybe it could undo the damage it had caused. If they could just... A harsh, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, followed by a sudden, blinding flash. A voice, deep and resonant, rumbled through the air, so loud that Jace felt it vibrating in his bones. It was a voice like no other, neither human nor alien, but something far older, far more powerful. "Why have you come?" the voice intoned. The crew froze in place, staring wide-eyed at the orb, which now glowed with a ferocious intensity. It wasn't just an object anymore, it was a being, a presence, its power overwhelming everything around them. Jace started, his throat dry. "We were just trying to understand." "Understand?" The voice was tinged with mockery, though there was an unmistakable undercurrent of ancient power that radiated from it. "You are not meant to understand. You are meant to leave." The chamber shook again, the walls pressing in tighter, the energy from the orb increasing exponentially. But in that moment, something strange happened. Jace felt a surge of connection, a sudden realization that this force, this station, wasn't a threat. It was a trial. A test. "Listen to me," Jace shouted, pushing past his growing fear. "We didn't come here to harm you. We're not your enemies. We're trying to survive the rift, just like you." The silence that followed felt suffocating. But then, the voice spoke again, softer now, as if considering his words. "Survive," the voice said, almost as if testing the word. "The rift is not merely a place of destruction. It is a place of rebirth. Those who find their way through it are changed. And the change is the price you will pay." Jace's heart skipped a beat. What was this entity trying to tell them? He felt his grip on reality slipping. This was no longer about exploration, no longer about saving lives. This was about something far greater. The rift was a boundary. It was a force of nature that transcended everything they knew. The walls stopped moving. The room stilled. The voice continued. "You have opened the gate. Now you must choose. Leave, and forget all that you have seen. Or stay, and become." The word "become" echoed through the chamber, and the orb pulsed with a final, brilliant flash of light. It enveloped Jace and the crew in a rush of power, flooding their senses with sensations they couldn't comprehend. It was a blinding moment of unity, of clarity, and then... nothing. Silence. Jace blinked, disoriented, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. He was still standing in the center of the chamber. The crew was still with him, though they were just as lost as he was. The energy in the room had dissipated, but there was a lingering sense of something different. Something had changed. But what? The crew stood frozen, their gazes fixed on the orb. It no longer pulsed with power, it had returned to a dull glow. The station, too, seemed to have calmed, as if it had made its decision. As if it had judged them, and found them worthy. Did we make it?" Lieutenant Daniels whispered, his voice uncertain. Jace opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. They had survived the rift, but they hadn't just survived, it felt as though they had been reborn, changed in ways they couldn't yet understand. It wasn't just the station that had been waiting for them, they had been waiting for this moment too. Jace took a slow breath. The voice had said it, the rift was a place of rebirth, a trial. And now, they were standing on the precipice of something new. Something that had the potential to reshape everything they had known. "Let's go home," Jace said, his voice steady, though his mind was still reeling. "We've made our choice." The Phoenix rose from the station, its engines roaring to life once more. As it ascended, the walls of the station receded behind them, and the rift, that vast, terrible force, began to fade into the distance. The crew didn't speak. They didn't need to. What they had experienced, what they had survived, was beyond words. And as the stars came back into view, they knew this, the rift had changed them, in ways they couldn't yet fathom. But whatever lay ahead, they were ready. Ready for the unknown. Ready for whatever came next.